Franz Kafka died asking his best friend to burn every word he had ever written. Every letter, every story, every novel, all of it gone. His best friend said yes, and then did the exact opposite. Which means the most influential writer of the 20th century is one man's broken promise away from never having existed. But here's the part nobody talks about. Kafka didn't just want his books destroyed. He spent his entire life convinced that writing them was proof of his own failure. Not his greatest achievement, his greatest failure. That's not a man who struggled to be recognized. That's a man who was recognized and still believed he had gotten everything wrong. You probably know Kafka's name, even if you've never read a word he wrote. Kafkaesque. You've heard that word, maybe used it. It means something, a situation so absurd, so suffocating, so impossible to escape that it stops making sense. What most people don't know is that Kafka didn't invent that feeling. He lived it, every day, for his entire life. And the books that gave that feeling a name, the Metamorphosis, the Trial, the Castle, were never supposed to exist. They were written in secret, hidden from his family, and then condemned to destruction by the only person who truly understood them. To understand why, you have to go back to the beginning, not the beginning of the books, the beginning of the man. In 1883, Franz Kafka was born in Prague into a household controlled by one person. His father, Hermann Kafka, was a large, loud, self-made businessman who had built everything he had from nothing. He was proud of that. He wanted his son to be proud of it too. Franz was not. Franz was thin, quiet, and consumed by ideas his father couldn't understand and didn't want to. Hermann wanted a son who would take over the business. He got a son who wanted to write. The collision between those two versions of what Franz was supposed to be never resolved. It just kept going year after year, deepening into something that Kafka himself described as the central wound of his life. From childhood, Franz was exactly the type of person Hermann could not understand. Slight where his father was robust, silent where his father was loud, consumed by ideas that produced nothing visible, nothing measurable, nothing that could be put in a shop window. He didn't hit him. He didn't need to. He had something more efficient than hitting. He had the look. Franz described that look in his diary more than once. The look of someone who evaluates you and has already reached a conclusion before you open your mouth. The look that says, without saying anything, what you are is not enough. Franz grew up convinced that something in him was fundamentally broken, not because Hermann told him directly, but because Hermann never told him the opposite. That is more damaging, always. The years passed and the distance between them didn't close, it formalized. Franz studied law because it was expected. He got a job at an insurance company because it was expected. He lived in the family home until he was 30 because, in part, it was expected. And at night, when the house was asleep, he wrote. He wrote between midnight and 3 in the morning. Those 3 hours were the only ones that belonged entirely to him, the only ones in which nobody evaluated him, nobody expected anything of him. Nobody could look at him with that look. In 1919, aged 36, Kafka wrote the most honest thing he had ever written in his life. Not a story, not a novel, a letter. 100 pages addressed to his father. In it, he said everything he had never been able to say out loud. That he had spent his childhood trying to figure out what Hermann wanted from him without ever succeeding. That he had learned to move through the house like someone who doesn't want to make noise. That the feeling of being fundamentally inadequate wasn't something he had developed. It was something that had been built into him, brick by brick, through silences and looks and expectations never met. The letter ended with something that sounded almost like a plea. Franz told his father he hadn't written it to attack him. He wrote it to understand, to find some explanation for why at 36 he still felt like a child who had done something wrong without knowing what. He gave the letter to his mother to deliver. His mother read it, gave it back to Franz, and told him she wasn't going to give it to Hermann because she didn't want to upset him. The letter went back in the drawer. Hermann never read a word of it, and Franz, who had spent 36 years not understanding why he felt condemned without knowing his crime, sat down and wrote the trial. Joseph K. wakes up one morning accused. Nobody tells him of what. He spends the entire novel trying to appeal to an authority that doesn't respond, navigating a bureaucracy with no interest in his innocence, trying to understand a system that has already made a decision about him before he can say a single word. At the end, he is executed, without explanation, without anyone having ever told him what he did wrong. Franz Kafka never found out what he did wrong either. The difference is, he turned it into literature. In 1917, Kafka was diagnosed with tuberculosis. He was 35 years old. He had been working as an insurance lawyer for years, a job he described as quietly suffocating, while writing at night in the hours between midnight and 3 in the morning. That was his writing time, the only hours that belonged entirely to him. The tuberculosis changed everything, not because it stopped him from writing, because it gave him permission to stop pretending he was anything other than what he was. Kafka had spent years engaged in women he couldn't marry, working at a job he couldn't leave, living in a city he couldn't escape, under a father he couldn't satisfy. The disease became the one thing nobody could argue with. It was, in a strange way, the first honest thing in his life. He wrote the Metamorphosis 8 years before the diagnosis, but the image at its center, a man who wakes up one morning transformed into something his family can no longer recognize, something that disgusts them, something that has to be hidden from visitors, reads differently when you know what was coming. Gregor Samsa doesn't become a monster because something external happens to him. He becomes a monster because he stops being useful. The moment he can't go to work, can't provide, can't perform the function his family needs him to perform, he becomes a problem to be managed and eventually eliminated. Kafka's family managed him for years. His illness gave them a new category to put him in. But here's what nobody expected. The tuberculosis didn't slow his writing, it accelerated it. And in the final years of his life, sick and increasingly unable to work, Kafka produced some of the most precise, controlled, unsettling prose in the history of the German language. Which makes what happened next even harder to explain. There was one person in Kafka's life who understood what the writing was. His name was Max Brod. They had been friends since university. Brod was also a writer, talented, prolific, eventually successful. But he understood from the beginning that Kafka was doing something different, something that didn't have a category yet. During 20 years, Brod was Kafka's only real reader. And during those 20 years, Kafka told him several times in different ways that when he died, he wanted everything to disappear. In 1921, Kafka gave Brod a note, written by hand, brief, without drama. It said that all his diaries, manuscripts, letters, and drafts should be burned unread after his death, without exceptions, without deliberation, burned. Brod told him directly, looking him in the face, that he would not do it. Kafka nodded and kept giving him manuscripts. This is the detail that changes everything, and it's a detail that most of Kafka's biographers mention in passing, as if it were a curiosity, when in reality it is the key to everything. Kafka knew Brod would refuse. He had told him. Brod had confirmed it. There was no ambiguity. And yet, Kafka continued handing him texts with the destruction note attached. Why? Because Kafka didn't want his books to disappear. He wanted not to be the person who made the decision that they existed. That is the difference, and it is enormous. Publishing something is an act of authorization. It is saying what I made deserves to exist, deserves to be read, deserves to take up space in the world. For most writers, that is simply the natural conclusion of having finished something. For Kafka, it was impossible. Not because he didn't know whether his books were good. At some level, he knew they were. But because believing they were good meant believing he himself was worth something. And that was the belief that Hermann Kafka had made impossible in him over 30 years. So, he found the only solution his psychology would allow. He gave the books to the one person he trusted completely, with an instruction he knew would be ignored, and transferred the responsibility for his own literary existence to someone else. If the books existed, it wasn't his fault, it was Broad's. If the books failed, he hadn't been the one who decided to publish them. That was Broad. If the books were great, and they were, he could go on not having to believe it because the decision had never been his. Kafka died on June 3, 1924, in a sanitarium in Kirling, Austria. He was 40 years old. Tuberculosis had reached his larynx, and he could no longer eat or drink with unbearable pain. In his final days, he was still correcting the proofs of a short story collection that would be published shortly afterwards. The last day he could speak, he asked the doctor to stop the morphine. He wanted to be completely conscious. Broad was in Prague when he received the news. He took the first train. He arrived too late. That same week, he began organizing the manuscripts. The Trial was published in 1925, 1 year after Kafka's death. The Castle followed in 1926, America in 1927. None of these novels were finished. Kafka had abandoned all of them. They have no endings because he never wrote endings for them. Broad published them anyway, assembling the chapters in the order he thought made the most sense. Which means the novels the world knows, the ones that defined an entire sensibility, that gave a name to a kind of modern despair, that influenced Borges, Camus, Beckett, and almost every serious writer who came after, are incomplete. They are fragments. They are, in a very precise sense, exactly what Kafka feared they were. And they are still, 100 years later, the most accurate description of what it feels like to be a person trapped inside a system that was not designed for you. In 2019, the original manuscript of The Trial sold at auction for over $1 million. The man who wanted it burned is now studied in universities in over 40 countries. Here is the detail you will repeat to someone tonight. In his final months, Kafka fell in love. Her name was Dora Diamond. She was 25 years old. She was the daughter of an Orthodox Jewish family from Poland, had fled her home to escape an arranged marriage, and was working in the resort's kitchen. Kafka saw her mending clothes by the sea and couldn't stop looking at her. They moved to Berlin together that autumn. Germany was in the midst of catastrophic hyperinflation. The price of bread changed twice a day. People burned note banks to keep warm because it was cheaper than wood. Kafka and Dora were poor. They were cold. He was sick and getting worse. And yet the letters Kafka wrote that year are the quietest of his life, the only ones in which something resembling happiness appears without immediate apology. He lived with Dora for 9 months, the last 9 months of his life. During that time, he gave her manuscripts, private texts written only for her that form no part of any published collection because Dora never shared them with Broad. They were hers. Kafka had given them to her, not to the literary archive of posterity. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, the Gestapo raided Dora's apartment in Berlin. They confiscated everything they found, including the box where she kept Kafka's manuscripts. Dora spent decades trying to recover them. She contacted authorities, intermediaries, anyone who might know something. She never found anything. The manuscripts of Kafka the world knows exist because a man broke a promise. The ones that were perhaps the only ones Kafka would have wanted to survive, the ones he wrote in the only year of his life in which he was something close to free, are held somewhere by history that nobody has found yet. Or they no longer exist. we will never know. Kafka spent his life convinced he had nothing worth saying. The century that followed him suggests otherwise. The question he never answered, and that nobody has answered for him, is whether the person who creates something gets to decide what it's worth, or whether that decision belongs to everyone who comes after. If you think about that question differently after this video, leave it in the comments. I read them. And if you want to keep reading between the lines, the next story is already waiting.